The day I came back to Santiago, the first thing I felt wasn't the winter cold or the heavy city air. It was the weight of my last name on my back, like someone had hung it around my neck again without asking. The pilot announced our descent and I looked out the window. The mountains were there, huge still like always. Below, the cloud of smog over the valley. That kind of dirty blanket you learn to love because it means home, even if you've sworn 1,000 times you'll never come back. Mark was half asleep, his head resting against the seat, his headphones hanging loose. The blue light of the plane traced his eyelashes. I thought he looked calm, almost untouched by the heaviness that was tightening my jaw. That was one of his superpowers. He could be anywhere in the world and still be himself, without asking the past for permission. I couldn't. At 35, I felt like I was coming back as a grounded teenager. My parents didn't come to pick us up at the airport. They'd already warned me in one of those curt messages, full of perfectly placed punctuation marks and badly disguised affection. Your brother will pick you up. We're very busy at the plant. Very busy at the plant. The elegant way of saying we're about to lose everything. I saw him before he saw us. Raul, my older brother. Same broad body, same slightly crooked walk, but now with a new belly straining his shirt and his hair thinning at the crown. His hands were in the pockets of his coat, and he was checking his phone with the look of someone whose time is being wasted. When he finally looked up and recognized me, he smiled. But it wasn't a happy smile. It was that condescending smile every younger sibling in the world knows. La Larita, he said, opening his arms like some uncle. He hugged me quickly, a couple of pats on the back. He shook Mark's hand, a brief, firm squeeze man to man, as if that simple gesture settled the hierarchy. Long time, he added. So now we're important, huh? He said it jokingly, but the words hung there between the three of us like cold smoke. I just smiled. When you go back to the house where they disowned you, you learn fast how to measure every move. The drive from Pudahuel was a kind of silent recap of everything that had happened in these years without me. We took the highway, the windows fogged up, the radio turned down low. On the right, the real estate billboards flashed by. All those new apartment buildings stacked like shoeboxes, promises of modern living with a view of nothing. Further ahead, the silhouette of Costanera Center cutting in gray against an even grayer sky. In the distance, the white peaks like a clean memory that never quite manages to fall over the city. And how are they seeing this in Israel? Raul asked out of nowhere. That company of yours. The scooters. I swallowed. Scooters, I corrected softly. And they're seeing it fine. We have liquidity. We can invest. He nodded like he was weighing an offer in some street bazaar, not the salvation of the family business. Right. But remember, this isn't some toy startup, okay? There are people here, there's history. It's not just pressing a button and deleting whatever you don't like. He said it staring straight ahead without looking at me. As if he already knew that the word delete had been circling in my head long before I got on the plane. Mark turned his face slightly toward me. He didn't say anything, but I felt his question in the air. Are you sure you want to do this? His hand brushed my knee soft, a tiny gesture that anchored me for a few seconds. I kept my eyes fixed on the highway. My family's company didn't start as a company. It started as a sticky stain on my grandfather's hands. Keule is not a famous fruit. It doesn't show up on tourist posters. It doesn't have the glamour of grapes or the drama of cherries. It's a strange fruit, thick, kind of misshapen, a strong yellow, sweet and odd, that grows on trees that seem unsure whether they really want to be fruit trees or not. My grandfather had one in the backyard of the house in Chile. As a kid, he would pick the fruit and my grandmother made jam and liqueur for guests. The neighbors started asking for jars. Then they started paying for them. The rest was a matter of time, ambition, and that very Chilean mix of intuition and sheer stubbornness. By the time I was born, the processing plant already existed. It was on the outskirts of Santiago, surrounded by warehouses, mechanic shops, and empty lots. A long shed with a zinc roof, the smell of sugar and alcohol soaked into the walls. In the 90s, the company already had its own label, Keule Clara, my mother's name in golden cursive. Liqueurs, fruit and syrup jams. A niche product, as the executives like to say, but very profitable. This is yours and your brother's, my dad would repeat when I was little, showing me the production lines with that swollen pride that sometimes gets mistaken for love. I believed him. For many years I believed him. Until I met Mark. I'm not going to drag out the story of our family war. That would be a whole other episode. I'll just say the essential. My parents never accepted that I moved to Tel Aviv with a man they saw as some weird foreigner, half Jewish, half who knows what. One of those guys who show up on the news when there are bombs. They never accepted that I'd walk away from the company, the country, the last name as my one and only future. They didn't accept that I chose another life. So they stopped accepting me. The night they told me I was disowned was the last night I slept in my old room, in the house in WinOwl. I can still hear the sound of the metro in the distance, the bark of a stray dog out on the street, the yellow light from the lamppost sneaking in through the blinds. I remember the smell of keule and sugar clinging to my father's clothes as he gave me a speech about loyalty and tradition. If you leave with him, don't come back asking us for anything, he said. I looked at his hands, tried to memorize the lines on them just in case I missed them later. I never imagined that 6 years later he'd call me to ask for help. It wasn't really him, though. It was my mother, her voice sharpened by guilt. Your brother can't handle this alone, Loretta. This thing with the banks got ugly. We made mistakes, yes, but you know how to deal with these things. You're good with numbers. Talk to Raul. See what can be done. She didn't say she was sorry. She never used the word wrong in any sentence that had to do with me. But she called. And that, for me, was already an earthquake. That first night back, we didn't go to my parents' house. Mark and I stayed at an apart hotel in Providencia, near Manuel Montt. From the balcony you could see a slice of the Mapocho River, low and brown, and the office buildings staring at each other as if they didn't trust one another. Santiago at night had that same sad glow I remembered. Streetlights over wet sidewalks, the few yellow buses still left, taxis driving by and making the windows tremble. And the cold slipping in through the cracks despite the heater. Mark showered first. I opened the suitcase and took out the envelope I'd printed in Tel Aviv. Balance sheets, projections, the information Raul had sent me by email, half finished, full of holes. I sat at the kitchenette table, laptop open, stomach empty. Steam from the bathroom flooded the room, carrying the smell of plain soap. Do you regret it? He asked, coming out in a towel, his dark hair stuck to his forehead. Not yet, I answered. Give me a few days. He smiled, tired, came up behind me and rested his hands on my shoulders. The fabric of my t-shirt was cold, and his fingers were almost burning. For a second, I thought of everything we had built far from here. The office in Florentine, the first scooter prototypes, the sleepless nights before launch, my name in articles my parents never read. We'd created a brand that moved on its own through the streets of Europe, Asia, the Middle East. Scooters gliding through cities I'd never even set foot in, while my last name stayed stuck to jars of fruit and syrup, hidden on supermarket shelves in Chile. There are ironies you can only fully understand at night. The next day, before going to the plant, I stopped by the house in WinOwl. I insisted on that. I didn't want the first scene to be in a dining room with partners at the table, or in the cold office role now called general management. I wanted to see the house. I needed to measure how much of me was still in there. The facade was the same. The small front yard with the same rose bushes, the green-painted gate, the tree my dad always said he'd cut down and never did. The difference was invisible, but it was there. That kind of wear in the bricks, the paint, the curtains that haven't been changed in years because there are other priorities. My mother opened the door as if I'd just come back from the supermarket, not another continent. You're thinner, was the first thing she said. Do you eat over there? I hugged her. She stayed rigid for a second, then her hands came around my back, awkwardly. The smell was the same as in my childhood. Home-cooked food, dish soap, a hint of hidden cigarette smoke. And that strong perfume she used to wear on Sundays for Mass, even though it was Tuesday now. My father was in the living room, sitting in his armchair, watching the news with the sound off. When I walked in, his eyes dropped to my shoes first. Then he looked up like he was going through an inventory. We stared at each other for a second. There were no grand words, no dramatic speeches. "Hi, Hija," he said finally. I nodded. I walked over, gave him a brief hug. I could feel his bones more sharply under the shirt. He'd grown old. Not so much in his face where he still had that hard expression, but in his shoulders. They'd sunk more, like he was carrying something heavier than crates of keule. Silence settled into the room like another piece of furniture. My mother went to the kitchen to make coffee, as if coffee could fix what blood had failed to. "Raoul says you arrived fine," my father said, still looking at the mute screen. That things have gone well for you over there." I wanted to tell him that, well, didn't even begin to cover it. That we'd raised rounds of funding he couldn't even imagine, that we had a patent in process, that in Tel Aviv they called me founder, a word that in his world sounded like some deadly sin of arrogance. But all I said was, "Yeah, we're not lacking anything." That unsettled him. His brow tightened, as if there were an accusation hidden somewhere in that sentence. My mother came back with the tray, the white cups, the sugar bowl I knew by heart. "Your father's been losing a lot of sleep over this whole business with the company," she informed me, as if I hadn't already pieced it together from the bank emails. "Your brother's had bad luck." Bad luck. Families call a lot of things that: bad management, small-scale corruption, that whatever, it's everyone's money attitude. Cowardice. We drank coffee while digging little tunnels of small talk. "How's the weather over there? Is it true the sirens can go off any minute? Does Mark have family? Do you speak Hebrew or English?" I answered on autopilot. Inside, I was counting down the minutes until we left for the plant. Because the real reason for my return wasn't sitting at that table. It was waiting in corridors of steel and the smell of burnt sugar. An hour later, Raoul picked up Mark and me and drove us to the factory. Traffic was heavy. On the corner of Grecia and Vicuña Mackenna, I saw a new mural that hadn't been there before, color screaming over a peeling wall. People with backpacks, street vendors, a woman with a little cart full of steaming sopapillas. The city kept on living, indifferent to the silent collapse of a last name. The plant was just as gray as in my memories. A metal gate, the guard in his booth, the inner yard with a few pallets stacked up and a couple of old trucks parked. But from the entrance you could already feel something different. Less noise, less movement, less life. "We've had to cut back on shifts," Raoul explained as we walked. "And with the dollar going crazy, importing good quality sugar isn't worth it anymore. But you'll understand all that when we look at the numbers." The "you'll understand" rubbed me the wrong way. It sounded like, once someone who actually knows what they're doing takes a look, the tone of someone who talks to you as if you're brilliant, but still a child. We walked through the production lines. Some were stopped, covered in plastic. The few workers who were left glanced at us sideways. Some recognized me, I could tell by the way they moved, by the murmur that left my name floating in the air for a moment. The smell of keule hit me like a physical memory. Sweet, intense, with a faint hint of fermentation. That's what my childhood smelled like. That's how Sundays smelled when my dad came back from the plant and lifted me in his arms without washing his hands. We went into the main office where a sign now read General Manager, Raul Valdez. The last name in bold. It didn't say Valdez y Asociados, or Familia Valdez. Just him. Inside, the chaos was elegant. Piles of papers, a huge screen with several Excel sheets open, a half-finished bottle of mineral water. In one corner, a framed photo of my dad in a white hard hat, one of those construction ones, smiling at the camera. Raul sat down behind the desk and gestured for us to take the chairs in front. "Look, Laura," he began. "I don't want this to turn into some kind of hostile audit or anything like that. Your family. It's just that things got complicated on us." I opened my laptop slowly, put the envelope with the documents on the table. "I want to see everything," I said. "Income statements for the last 5 years, breakdown of bank debts, contracts with suppliers, and the loans you took out in the company's name." Raul's smile stretched a little. "Wow, you came in sharp," he joked. Just like when you'd argue with the old man over the price of sugar. Sugar didn't sign contracts with banks, I answered. You did. The air tightened. Mark beside me stayed quiet, just watching. I knew he was picking up more than he let on. He'd spent years reading micro-expressions in investor meetings. And Raul had the face of someone who's been sweeping things under the rug. He handed me some folders. We started going through them. The numbers jumped out like grease stains on a blank page. Payments to an external company, Servicios Logísticos RV Spa, RV, Raul Valdez. Big amounts labeled as strategic consulting. Loans for considerable sums, using the plant's machinery as collateral, but the funds never fully showing up in the company's accounts. Bounce checks, verbal agreements with distributors that were never put into writing. What's this? I asked, pointing at a series of recurring transfers. Raul leaned over to see. Those are representation expenses. Travel, trade fairs, meetings with buyers down south. The kind of things you have to do to move product. In Miami, I read out loud. 3 trips to Miami in 2 years, Raul. We don't sell keule in Miami. He cleared his throat. Contacts, Laura. You have to move around. You have to modernize, right? Or do you think those scooters of yours just sell themselves? I didn't answer. I just wrote something down in a notebook. I knew he hated when I took notes. It made him feel like a hospital patient. The rest of the day was more of the same. Numbers that didn't add up, vague explanations, a feeling of invisible grime stuck to everything. By the time we left the plant, it was already dark. The yard was almost pitch black, lit only by a couple of yellow floodlights. The air smelled of cold sugar and wet asphalt. It's ugly, Mark murmured once we were in the car. But it's not dead. It was going to be dead, I said. If they hadn't called me now, in 6 months this would have disappeared. We drove back to the apart hotel almost in silence. Santiago stretched out outside the windows with its red and white lights. Shop windows still open, newspaper stands with papers no one was buying anymore. We passed near Plaza Italia, or Plaza Dignidad, as some people still insist on calling it. There were flags hanging from a building, new graffiti, a sense of poorly healed scar lingering in the air. I watched it all with a strange mix of nostalgia and detachment, like I was watching a movie I'd acted in as a teenager. That night, after a quick dinner at a bar in Lasteria, I stayed alone on the balcony with my laptop. Mark went to bed first. Jet lag hit him harder whenever he tried to adapt to my country. The cold was biting my fingers. Even so, I kept going through the financial statements. I put on my headphones and played a nearly inaudible instrumental playlist. The Mapocho flowed below like a thick shadow. It was there, between columns and rows, that the real fracture showed up. It wasn't just bad management. It wasn't just bad luck. It was fraud. Small, the kind that builds up bit by bit, convinced no one will ever notice. But fraud all the same. I found a pattern in the payments to Servicios Logísticos RV Spa, a constant percentage disappearing into personal accounts. The dates lined up with purchases I already knew about from my sister-in-law's social media. A new car, a Caribbean vacation, home renovations. What hurts isn't that they steal your money. It's that they steal it believing you're never coming back to look. At midnight, my phone buzzed. A voice message from my mother. Hijita. I just wanted to know if you needed anything. I don't really understand how these modern things work, those studies you do. But I trust you, okay? I trust that you're not going to leave us alone. I listened to it several times. I trust you. I trust that you're not going to leave us alone. The part she didn't say, but that I knew by heart, was, even though we did leave you alone. I stayed up late building projections. If we stopped paying certain suspicious contracts, if we renegotiated the main debt with the bank, if we sold off some non-critical assets, the company could survive. Not intact, not comfortable, but alive. The real problem was something else. The general manager. My brother. You can't save a house if you leave the arsonist with the keys. At 3 a.m, exhausted, I closed the laptop. I walked barefoot into the bedroom. Mark was sleeping on his stomach, His arm stretched out toward my side of the bed, as if he'd reached for me halfway through a dream. I slid in next to him and rested my forehead against his back. He smelled like he always did. Soap, a faint trace of sweat, a hint of the afternoon coffee. I don't know if it was the fatigue or the mix of familiar smells, but in that moment I felt a very simple wish, that none of this had anything to do with me. That the company had a different name, that my last name wasn't on the labels, that no one expected me to be the link that kept everything from completely breaking. But that fantasy lasted as long as a breath out. Reality came back with the force of the mountains. Solid, immovable. I am Hector Valdez's daughter, I thought. And even if I went all the way to the other end of the Mediterranean, that weight never left. The next day, I asked for a meeting with just my parents without Raul. We sat in the same dining room where, years ago, they had read out my disinheritance sentence. The table was the same, the plastic tablecloth too. The light coming through the window marked the dust hanging in the air. I laid a folder in front of them with summaries anyone could understand. No MBA required. The company can be saved. I began, my voice steady. But not like this. They looked at each other. My mother clenched her hands in her lap. What do you mean not like this? My father asked. I mean Raul can't keep running it. And that you've been covering his personal debts with company money. That has to end today. My mother blinked quickly, like someone had just shone a bright light straight into her eyes. He's your brother, she whispered. You can't just throw him out into the street. I'm not throwing him into the street, I replied. I'm leaving him responsible for what's his. That wrong-footed them. In families like mine, the word responsibility gets used a lot outward, never inward. I showed them the evidence, the transactions, the related companies, the unpaid interest. My father went red, then pale. He looked like a man reading the autopsy of a living son. That can't be, he muttered. Your brother isn't like that. I looked him in the eye. He is. And you allowed it. That you was a knife. I felt it as I said it. But I was no longer at an age where I could sugarcoat the truth with euphemisms. My mother started crying quietly. Not the dramatic kind of crying, but an older one made of defeat. What do you propose then? My father asked, his voice dulled. I took a deep breath. I'd made up my mind at dawn, but saying it out loud made it irreversible. That I take control of the company. There was a silence so long I could hear the ticking of the wall clock, the same clock that had marked the hours of my childhood. You, my father repeated, as if he didn't know me. Yes, me. Legally, I still have shares, remember? The ones Grandpa handed out when we were kids. We never signed them over. And besides, Raul sent me documents he shouldn't have sent. With that, I can present a solid case to the bank so they trust me as the new manager. I still have shares. Saying it was like suddenly taking back a quarter of my story that they'd expropriated in words but not on paper. My father stood up from his chair, walked over to the window, looked out at the street as if the answer were out there. That would be, he started, it would be a humiliation for your brother. No more than seeing our last name on a list of judicial auctions, I answered. No more than leaving 40 families without work because we didn't dare set a boundary. He rested his forehead against the glass. His reflection blurred into that of a passing bus. Are you going to have him thrown in jail? He asked, still not looking at me. No, I said calmly. I won't do anything criminal as long as he signs his resignation and agrees to take responsibility for his personal debts without touching the company. My mother sniffed, struggling. You're going to leave us caught in the middle, Loretta, she complained. Your brother on one side, you on the other. Us in the middle, with all the shots coming our way. You put yourselves in the middle a long time ago, I wanted to say. But I swallowed it. Instead I said, Mama, Papa, if I don't do this, in 6 months there'll be nothing. No company, no house, no savings. Nothing. At least this way, something remains. And the last name, too. The word last name had an effect on them. For me, for a lot of people, a last name is a kind of private flag. You don't want to see it lying in the mud. We paused. My mother got up to bring water. My father sat down again, smaller somehow. "And what would you get out of this?" he asked suddenly. "Don't play the altruist. You want something." Honesty, I thought. The chance to show you that the mistake was yours, not mine. A bit of revenge too, maybe. "A percentage," I answered honestly. "I'm going to invest my own money in Mark's. I'm not doing it for free, but I'm not going to take away what's yours either. I just want you to understand that from now on, decisions will be made differently." My father pressed his lips together. "Mark," he repeated, with that tone like the word itself tasted foreign. "And what does he have to do with any of this?" "He's my husband," I said, for the first time in that house with that word. "He has everything to do with it." My mother lifted her eyes from the water pitcher, startled. It's strange how sometimes one single word weighs more than any number. We didn't celebrate the announcement with hugs. There was no magical reconciliation, just a silent, almost bureaucratic agreement. I would be in charge of saving the company. They would be in charge of living with the decision made by the daughter they'd thrown out. The real confrontation came 2 days later, in the office at the plant, face to face with Raoul. I asked him to sit down, closed the door. Mark wasn't there. This was a fight that had to be just between us. "I found your logistics services," I began, no preamble. He smiled, but his eyes sharpened. "And? Every manager outsources things. It's legal." "Legal isn't the same as ethical," I replied. "And in your case, some of these operations are skirting the first one too. The banks are not going to be happy when they see this." I showed him the documents, the transfers, the overlaps with personal expenses, the flow of money between his spa and the company. He flipped through the pages with fake disinterest. "You don't understand how things work here, Laura. Over there, in your startups, everything is so transparent, so pretty. Doesn't work like that here. Here you have to hustle for your beans." "You hustled with everyone else's money," I said. "Mom's, dad's, the workers." He slammed his open palm on the table. "I broke my back for this while you went off to play Silicon Valley," he spat, even though he couldn't even point to Tel Aviv on a map. "When you were off on your little emotional backpacking trip with your foreigner, I was here keeping this whole thing going." "You didn't keep it going," I answered quietly. "You're sinking it." We stared at each other, with that mix of hatred and sadness only siblings can feel. There were things we'd never said to each other, and now there would be no time to say them. "The board," he started. "I am the board," I cut in. "Legally, I hold the majority combined with mom and dad's shares. I've already spoken to the bank. They're willing to renegotiate if you step down from management." He froze. The word "step down" landed like a slab of concrete. "You're going to kick me out of my own company," he whispered. "It's not yours," I said, looking straight at him. "It's mine too. And while you see it as an ATM, I see it as the only decent inheritance Grandpa left us." In the end, it all came down to a piece of paper. I placed the resignation form on the desk. I'd prepared it with a lawyer friend in Tel Aviv over video call. The world had gotten smaller, but betrayal still came in the same old PDF format. "If you sign, I won't do anything else," I explained. "You'll be free to sort out your personal debts however you want. I'll speak to the bank so they don't go after our parents' house. If you don't sign, it's going to get ugly. And public." Raul clenched his jaw. I saw the vein stand out in his temple. "You were always the favorite kid, you know that?" he spat. "Even when they pretended to be mad at you, they always talked about how smart you were, how far you were going to go. I stayed here, putting up with the old man doing the dirty work, and now you show up to take everything away from me." I didn't know what to say to that, because part of me knew it was true. Maybe they had loved me more. Or maybe they'd just seen me as the promise he never was. But none of that justified what he'd done. "I'm not taking everything away from you," I said finally. I'm leaving you with something you never knew how to handle: your own life. He grabbed the pen, hesitated for a few seconds, then with a furious flick he signed. The sound of the stroke on paper was harsher than any shout. When he finished, he threw the pen on the desk and stood up. "I hope everything goes to hell for you," he muttered, staring at me with a brand new kind of hate. "I hope you see what this really is when you don't have some European banker throwing money at your little toys." He brushed my shoulder as he walked past me, just barely, went out and slammed the door. I was left alone in the office that, according to the sign, was still his. My legs felt weak. I sat down, stared at the resignation for a long time, as if it were a family photo I couldn't quite make sense of. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel a sweet, satisfying revenge. I felt a tired emptiness. Like when you finish moving heavy furniture and the house is suddenly quiet. The following days were an avalanche of technical decisions: meetings with the bank, with suppliers, with unions. Mark moved through that ecosystem of numbers and strategy like a fish in water. I, for the first time, was mixing what I'd learned in Tel Aviv with the smell of keule from my childhood. I proposed modernizing part of the distribution, making partnerships with gourmet stores in other countries, redesigning the label so it looked less 70s. Mark suggested integrating simple tech into the plant to reduce waste. The workers looked at us with a mix of hope and suspicion. I knew that, to them, I was still the daughter who left, the one who now came back by plane, dressed differently, with an accent just slightly twisted by years abroad. At the same time, a part of me was turning cold, almost surgical. I couldn't let guilt drive me. Every time my mother called me crying, saying Raul wouldn't answer her messages, I listened, I breathed, and then went back to the spreadsheet. The weight of family is silent. It doesn't sound like chains or shouting. It sounds like tiny sighs between phone calls, like looks that don't dare say what they're thinking, like, "Do what you have to do," hijja spoken with a broken voice. One afternoon, walking alone through the Lasteria neighborhood, trying to clear my head before another meeting with the bank, I stopped in front of a shop window. There were jars of artisanal jam, olive oils, sea salt with herbs. I saw a single jar of keule, dust from years ago, with an old label from our brand. No one was looking at it. It was there like a witness from another time. I saw my reflection in the glass. My face tired, older than I felt on the inside. And behind me, the city with its buildings, its cars, its people who went on living without knowing that a keule company was about to either come back to life or die just a few blocks away. For the first time, I wondered if maybe this wasn't just about saving a business. Maybe it was about redefining what family means when no one follows the script anymore. My parents started coming to the plant every now and then, walking slowly between the machines. My father spoke little. He watched, nodded, sometimes dared to correct me on tiny details like the order of the boxes in the warehouse. I left that space for him. It was his way of still feeling useful. One of those afternoons, I found him sitting alone in the office, looking at an old photo. Him, my grandfather, and Raul in front of the first warehouse. "You're not in it," he said without looking up. "I wasn't born yet," I answered. He ran his finger over the glass of the frame, wiping away a bit of dust. "Your brother. I don't know when he started to go crooked," he admitted at last. "At first he just did what I told him. Then he started telling me what had to be done. I wanted to believe that was good, that it was initiative." "It's not your fault, Papa," I said, even though part of me did blame him. "Of course it's my fault," he shot back. "I taught him that the company came before everything, that the last name was worth more than any person, that you had to make the most of opportunities. I never taught him that there were limits, because I never had them clear myself." He went quiet for a moment. "With you I was different," he added. "With you I demanded perfection, and when you didn't do what I wanted, I punished you like an employee going over to the competition." He said it with a clarity that hurt. It was easier to say you were disinherited than to accept that you'd chosen something else. That you didn't need the company to be someone. That to be someone hung there in the office. I didn't know how to answer. I didn't have a speech prepared for that kind of late honesty. What you're doing now, he went on barely audible. I don't know if you're doing it for us, for revenge, or for the company, but thank you anyway. I looked at him. I saw a man, not the patriarch. An old man who didn't know how to ask for forgiveness and probably never would. I'm doing it because I didn't want our last name ending up in a clearance sale, I replied, half joking, half serious. And because 40 families aren't to blame for our stupidity. He laughed, a short, rough sound. You've always been tougher than all of us put together, he said. I didn't take it as a compliment. I took it as a diagnosis. The weeks went by. We signed the new agreement with the bank. We cut certain lines, boosted others. I landed a small contract with a gourmet store chain in Europe, using contacts from the scooter company. A strange, almost poetic crossover. Chilean keule traveling in the same containers that had once brought in parts for the scooters. Raul stopped speaking to my parents for a while. Then he started sending occasional messages, full of passive resentment. He never set foot in the plant again. I didn't go looking for him. Not because I didn't care, but because I knew any conversation would just reopen wounds that, for now, needed to scab over. The night before flying back to Tel Aviv, I sat once more on the apart hotel balcony. Santiago glowed below in shades of yellow and white, with that distant noise that never fully goes quiet. Mark came over with 2 cups of tea. He handed me one and stayed beside me in silence. Your face has changed, he said after a while. You look, I don't know if calmer or more tired. Both, I answered. It's like when you update an operating system. It runs better, but it drains more battery. He smiled. Would you do it again? He asked. If you could go back? I thought about Raul's signature, my mother's tears, my father's bent back staring at the first warehouse in an old photo. I thought about the workers who, that very afternoon, had walked out of the plant with their lunch boxes, not knowing that a couple of contracts signed thousands of kilometers away had just saved their jobs. I thought about myself, opening that email from my mother after years of silence. Yes, I said at last, I'd do it again. But maybe I'd speak differently, less cold. Your coldness is what saved them, Mark replied gently. Someone had to think like a surgeon. I leaned against his shoulder, felt his warmth through the fabric. I don't know if I saved them, I murmured. I saved the company. Them, they'll have to save themselves. Silence settled over us like a blanket. Below, a group of young people laughed loudly on the sidewalk. A dog barked. The metro passed underground, invisible, but I felt the vibration. Did it hurt, leaving them with Raul's debts? Mark asked. No judgment, just curiosity. Yes, I admitted. But it was the only way for them to understand that children aren't infinite extensions of their parents. Or the other way around. I drew a breath. All my life I felt like I was carrying something I hadn't chosen. I went on. The last name, the company, the expectations, the guilt of having left. Coming here was like setting the backpack down, but not to abandon it. It was to open it up and divide what was inside. What's mine with me? What's theirs with them? Mark nodded, looking at me with that mix of love and respect that sometimes makes me uncomfortable, as if he sees me as braver than I am. In Tel Aviv, everyone talks about founders and leadership, I said with a faint smile. Here I had to lead something else. Not a new company, but an old story. And there's no pitch deck for that. He laughed softly. You could still make a presentation, he joked. How to save the family business without saving the image your parents have of you. Now that would be the real case study, I answered. I looked at the city one more time, thought of my parents sleeping in Nunoa, in a house that was no longer at risk of being auctioned off, but somehow still felt changed. Thought of Raul, in some apartment more expensive than he could afford, trying to hold on to a life slipping through his fingers. And I thought about the warehouse, the machines, the smell of keule that had marked my childhood. That smell would still be there when I no longer was. That, in some way, gave me peace. The next day at the airport, my mother hugged me tighter than the first time. My father shook my hand clumsily and then, as if he'd reconsidered, pulled me into a quick hug. They didn't talk about forgiveness. They didn't ask me to come back. They didn't promise me anything. "Take care of yourself," my mother said, her eyes wet. "And thank you." "Take care of Dad," I replied. We parted without a scene. Sometimes that's what growing up is, learning to say goodbye without theatrics. On the plane as we took off, I watched through the window as the city shrank and the mountains loomed larger behind it, a white wall guarding all the stories that are too heavy to leave. Mark took my hand. "Ready?" he asked. "As ready as you can be when you're leaving something that was never entirely yours," I said. He squeezed my fingers. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe without that constant pressure on my chest. Not because everything was fixed. Not because my parents had changed or because my brother finally understood. But because I had finally drawn a clear line between what I carry out of love and what I carry out of fear. The company in trouble was no longer my silent torment. It was a project with figures, deadlines, and people accountable. A concrete problem, not a hereditary ghost. My family, on the other hand, was still a blurry territory, but that confusion no longer defined me. The weight of the last name was still there, yes. Only now it wasn't something they hung around my neck without asking. Now I held it in my hand the way you hold an old suitcase, knowing it has things worth keeping, and others you'll slowly take out over time. I don't know if one day they'll understand what I did. I don't know if my brother will ever stop seeing me as the traitor who took his kingdom away. The only thing I do know is that, from that trip on, when I think of the word family, I no longer feel just guilt and obligation. I also feel the quiet certainty that you can love without carrying everything. And that, for someone who went back to save what once threw her out, is already a kind of rest.